Remember when Exclusive Ace and a bunch of other huge creators tested if skill level affected ping, and it turned out that it did? However big, however small, it definitely did. Well, let's toss in some more evidence. Take a look at this quote from Activision's ping and matchmaking research paper. Another important dimension to consider when evaluating our success in providing a low delta ping to all of our players is skill. Notice they said low delta ping and not low ping. It's important that no matter the skill level of the player, we provide a low latency experience. The visualization below breaks down our delta ping metric by skill decile. And yes, they actually misspelled delta ping in this article. That's not me. This is an actual screenshot from the article. They misspelled it. In it, you can see that our delta ping experience is highly consistent for all of our players, regardless of their skill level. In other words, a player's skill has no impact on the latency experience we provide. Alright, now let's unpack this. Activision defines another term called delta ping, which is something that they've made up. Essentially, sometimes Call of Duty will have you connected to a data center in your region that is further away than the closest data center to you. For example, you live in Texas and the closest data center to you is Dallas with 30 milliseconds data center ping, but you're connected to a data center in Memphis, Tennessee at 40 millisecond data center ping because it found a match for you there instead. Delta ping is the difference between the data center ping of the closest data center to you and the one you're actually connected to and playing on. In this example, your delta ping is 10 milliseconds because it's 40 minus 30. The reason they try to minimize this value is to make sure that you, in theory, sacrifice as little ping as possible when you're jumping servers in order to find a match. However, there's a reason that Activision invented this terminology. It's because with how strict their matchmaking is, they're forced to combine player pools from different data centers, and players are more or less guaranteed to have to sacrifice some ping in order to find an eligible match. Instead of coming up with some other excuse as to why players are sacrificing ping by jumping data centers, they instead paint the picture like it's in our best interest by saying they try to minimize the amount of delta ping per match. Even though that phrase is not only something they invented, but the only reason it exists in the first place is because the matchmaking is so darn strict in the first place. They literally say their success in providing a low delta ping, not normal ping. Case in point, ping is not king. Delta ping is king. And delta ping means ping sacrifice. That's literally what it means. Further, within this article, there should be a definition for low latency. However, there isn't any. With my experience, low latency is preferably anything under 30 ping. I consistently can play games like Fortnite on an Ethernet connection at 20 to 30 ping or lower, and that game has 100 players. Meanwhile, I'm playing COD and getting higher than 40 ping, and if I'm doing great, higher than 80 ping, virtually every single game with only 12 players per lobby. This doesn't make any sense unless we take into account the fact that COD's matchmaking is exponentially more strict than that of Fortnite. But they can say low latency all they want. They don't have to back it up. It's not illegal to say they feel it's necessary to provide all types of players with a low latency experience. I mean, they don't define it, so how is it bad to say? But of course, we have to recognize that it's not defined. If we refer back to this quote again, we can easily see how this sentence is doublespeak. It's the same verbal dancing we saw within the first Matchmaking Intel blog post. Right now, I'll give you a little crash course in understanding what Activision is really saying in every sentence. Not just Activision, but every corporation that tries to weasel their way out of controversy. You have to read every sentence multiple times, and if it sounds like something that the players really want to hear, make sure that you find every single possible interpretation of that sentence that could possibly be made. Then, once you find the one that lines up with the player experience, which is normally horribly overbearing matchmaking and greed, that's the interpretation they legally meant. Let's try to find what Activision is truly saying with this sentence here. A player's skill level has no impact on the latency experience we provide. Let's take a look at the variety of interpretations here. First interpretation could be, well, no matter how good you are, you're always going to have the same ping. Or, no matter how good you are, your delta ping will always be the same. And finally, your ping isn't altered directly based on your skill level. This is an interpretation that sounds great, but still explains the player experience of the better you do, the worse your ping gets. And if you don't believe me there, again, Exclusive Ace did an extensive study on this and concluded exactly what I just said. Regarding this last interpretation, of course, skill doesn't directly affect ping. Directly. They won't make your ping worse based on your skill alone. For example, if I'm the best, they're not just gonna purposely give me 80 ping because I'm better. However, as stated earlier, you have compatible matches. When you start doing better and get better, the amount of compatible matches shrinks, and as a result, you have worse ping because there are less options for you. Skill doesn't directly impact ping, as in the game will make sure your ping is worse the better you are. But because your skill improves, the amount of matches you are eligible to play in shrinks majorly, and as a result, the ping you have to sacrifice increases. The two aren't directly related, but because higher skill narrows your play options, skill is indirectly affected because of match scarcity. What they said is technically true, but it dodges the main narrative that ping is sacrificed for a match that suits you best instead of simply offering the best latency experience like they said in the first place. Remember, the only reason delta ping exists in the first place is because it's a scapegoat for them to throw out because players are forced to jump data centers. Now, the last thing I'll bring up is this table right here. It shows the average delta ping for each skill demographic, the bottom 0.1% being the worst and the top being the best. If you did your own research here, you may have seen this graph. Now, I have a couple of problems with this thing. It can be as accurate as they want, but there are glaring issues with it. First and foremost, the fact that delta ping is apparently the same across each skill bracket if you take a quick glance at it. This goes against testing and against the player experience. So how are they getting away with dodging this narrative? But before we tackle that, how about the obvious fact that this graph is absolutely the most alien thing I've ever seen? I looked up all different kinds of graphs and tried to figure out what kind of graph this thing is, and I could not find anything. This alone is concerning. It seems they made up their own style of graph that we have to figure out in order to understand what they're trying to put across. Now, at first glance, it seems like regardless of your skill level, you are sacrificing the same amount of ping when you switch data centers. Now, this could potentially make sense. However, you have to remember, delta ping is defined as ping that is sacrificed when players are bounced from one data center to another. This being said, the fact that each demographic experiences around the same delta ping must mean that every demographic has equally as strict matchmaking to keep players out of each other's buckets. That makes sense. As I've said before, matchmaking that forces you to switch data centers is strict matchmaking. It means that the matchmaking has to combine multiple player pools with worse ping than one another in order to provide more matching options. Instead of prioritizing a simple high ping connection by prioritizing only your closest data center, Call of Duty is choosing to force you to jump across data centers for more optimized matches. In theory, you never would have to switch data centers at all, period, if connection was the only factor weighed in matchmaking. But as we've gone over, there are a lot of factors that play into it, not the least of which are skill and engagement. But I digress. Since each skill bracket of the demographic experiences around the same average delta ping, that means that in theory, each skill bracket is also jumping across data centers a good amount of the time, which means that matchmaking has to be strict for everybody. That makes sense. Another thing to note is that the thickness of this bar, horizontally, is proportional to the rest of that percentile, meaning that the actual frequency that this delta ping sacrifice occurs is actually never stated. In simpler terms, this means that despite the top 10% and the bottom 10% both having around the same average delta ping, there's no indication of how frequently this sacrifice happens. The y-axis is measured in ping, but the x-axis is not measured in frequency or player count, or anything for that matter. This is concerning. The top 10% is likely experiencing this switch a lot more compared to the bottom 10%, but I can't confirm nor deny that because nobody has any way of knowing. All of the scaling of the bars within the graph isn't defined and therefore cannot be measured. This graph actually makes way less sense than we would have liked. In addition to this, take a look at this as well. We can see here that the bottom 10% of players have this little bar underneath the big bar, which ranges at, I'd say, around 0 to 3 milliseconds of ping that you sacrifice each jump, which indicates a smaller sacrifice, basically a negligible one. However, this small bar, indicating smaller ping sacrifices, shrinks as you move up the ladder until it's almost completely non-existent. Look, this means the better you get, the less likely you're going to have only a small ping sacrifice. The better you get, the more likely it is that you'll have a larger ping sacrifice, and this becomes nearly 100% odds once you reach the high ends of the player base. As you can see here, there are barely any zero delta ping games at all. While the lower percentiles have occurrences where they sacrifice small amounts of ping when they search for matches, the higher percentiles lack this frequency and are sacrificing anywhere from 5 to about 12 ping on average, with almost nothing lower than that. This tells us something important. Skill impacts your delta ping because the matchmaking is much more strict for higher level players. So here we have a graph that is completely unconventional, doesn't give us any sense of scale, and doesn't define how much players are actually in each percentile group, and even indicates that the better you get, the larger on average your ping sacrifices will be. And to top it all off, everything is just built in averages. There's no legitimate values. It's all averaged out. That means they've already crunched the numbers and put the results on the screen, which is pretty inconvenient for us who want to realistically interpret the data. This means that although they don't directly wreck your ping when you're better, your matchmaking requirements end up sacrificing your ping because you're better on average. The better you get, the harder the algorithm has to work to keep you away from the lower skilled casuals that shill out unfathomable amounts of money on cosmetics. They say low latency experience, but they never define this latency at all. In fact, all they do with this graph is say that players are sacrificing the same amount of ping on average when jumping across data centers, which tends to make sense considering that if you're jumping data centers, you shouldn't be sacrificing more than 20 ping. At least that's what this graph implies. But isn't that just what common sense suggests anyways? The only reason this would be different for higher level players is because they're the players that have to sacrifice upwards of 40 ping per game because they're not jumping across only one data center. They're jumping maybe 2 or 3 over because of how specific their requirements are. But of course, on average, the sacrifice is going to be around the same for everybody, but the frequency at which 0 ping is sacrificed and you're using your own data center is increasingly lower the better you get at the game, and the graph tells us that. So if we talk in averages, that's really irrelevant information as far as I'm concerned. But alas, this graph deals with averages. Also, you can see here that if you look closely, this recurring shape actually gets slightly higher with every progressive skill bucket, which indicates a higher delta ping the better you get on average. They never say that all players are matched with their best possible connection options every single game. They made up the term delta ping in order to make it sound like it's a good thing to prevent. Instead of claiming ping is king and saying they consistently search for the best possible connection every game, they're saying that they make sure we sacrifice the lowest amount of ping when fulfilling strict matchmaking requirements. Would you rather have the best possible connection or the lowest possible sacrifice? They may both sound relatively good on the surface, but I assure you that the way they handle themselves here, delta ping is king. This means the lowest possible sacrifice, and that doesn't guarantee the best possible connection. Ping is no longer king, and it hasn't been for a while. What do you guys think about this? Did I miss anything while I was interpreting the graph? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm Prime Pete. Take it easy.